Well, that was a long-winded and somewhat technical answer, I realize. But these issues are so very important and so close to the heart of my presentation tonight, I felt some elaboration was in order. Anyway, seems to me time for another question, and I'd like to call again on a student. Let's come back up front, where I see another scowling young person sitting at the opposite end of the row from my first interlocutor. You seem to be clutching rather tightly to that book in your lap, young lady. Could you show me what it is? Oh, yes, I see. She has a brand new copy of Richard Dawkins' recent salvo, The God Delusion. Did you have something you wanted to ask? Question 5. I really have to hand it to you, Cutsinger. So far, at least, you've stage managed this evening quite cleverly. First, it's this fundamentalist guy. Then another hired hand like you who gets paid for professing this whole religion thing. Then that weird New Age junkie with the bizarre hairdo. And now, last but not least, we hear from this Christian priest in the cute black dress. You get all these seemingly different people to throw you a bunch of softball questions, and then you put on this act like you're disagreeing with them or something. But truth is, they've all played right into your hands. None of them has the guts to ask the really tough questions, because each of their own pathetic little lives depends on helping you maintain the illusion. You did have to admit, I noticed, that there are at least a few intelligent people out there who think it's all just absurd, who look at religion, let's see, I wrote this down. Yeah, here it is. As a historical curiosity or as a language game or as primitive superstition. But you never said why that's so bad. You just assumed everybody here would come along on your little parade, and I'm sure most of them have. I doubt they've read a word of Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or Sam Harris, and I doubt you have either. Anyway, you haven't even come close to discussing what anybody in their right mind can see as the bottom line issue here. You've given the intelligent atheist no reason at all to think there's a God in the first place, and certainly no reason for thinking that this great cosmic entity is somehow responsible for the confusing and obviously contradictory belief systems you want us all to honor. I don't need all your rhetoric about religions as launching pads and believers as astronauts. If you expect serious, scientific people to take you seriously, you need to give them some evidence. Show us this God of yours. Prove it's all not just a bunch of wishful thinking. Religion's history, Cutsinger, and you and the rest of the deluded masses need to face up to that fact. Answer 5. In responding to the opening question tonight, I began by pointing out that it actually included a trinity of related issues all rolled into one. And unless I'm mistaken, that's true as well of the challenge you've posed. Your 3 questions might be expressed in a more or less rhetorical form, though unlike you, I'm far from thinking them rhetorical questions. First, isn't it obvious that faith is just wishful thinking? Something weak or childish people use to cope with a world that's too harsh to bear. Second, isn't it true there's no evidence for the claims of religion? And third, doesn't it follow that atheism is the more intelligent position than theism? Obviously, a book could be written in answer to each. About all I can do here tonight is provide just a hint, just the briefest of intimations, really, as to where I might start were I authoring these 3 books. My answers, in any case, as you probably expected, are no, no, and no. First of all, no. It's not obvious that faith is just wishful thinking, or at least it's not obvious it's necessarily so. I add that qualification because I agree that certain forms or levels of belief can be rather childish, as is the faith of the grown-up who still thinks God has a beard, or sits on a throne, or exists for the sole purpose of dispensing chocolate. But there's also such a thing as childish disbelief. In my experience, many atheists haven't been given all the chocolate they want and are therefore mad at God for not existing. William James's distinction between the tough and tender-minded applies to both theists and atheists. In both groups, we find people whose perspective on life is based on what they regard as objective facts and good reasons. Those are the tough-minded in James's terms. As well as other people whose perspectives is based on purely subjective desires, and those are the tender-minded. In any case, it's important to realize that the sophistical dismissiveness skeptics often employ in debate, which takes the form of saying, "Oh, you just think that because you're immature, or uneducated, or depressed, or had a dysfunctional family, or are subject to some sort of chemical imbalance," is a game two can play. Perhaps the atheist is just afraid of commitment or responsibility or being thought a fool by his friends. According to Freud, religion is really just repressed sexuality. But there's nothing to stop us from countering that sexuality is really just repressed religion. No, again, it isn't true. There's no evidence for the claims of religion. The crucial word here, of course, is evidence. I'm pretty sure when you use the term, you're thinking exclusively of empirical evidence, and thus buying into the assumptions I was critiquing earlier in responding to my first two interlocutors. Like many people on today's college campuses, you're assuming the only things we can truly know are things we have some sort of physical evidence for, or for which we might apply for some grant money. Things we can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, either directly through one or more of these five natural senses, or indirectly through the mediation of an instrument like a microscope that's been designed to magnify or amplify the reach of those senses. What I'm not sure you've noticed, however, is the statement, "The only things we can truly know are things we have some sort of physical evidence for," is not something there is or could be any physical evidence for. The claim of the empiricist or positivist is therefore just as metaphysical as the claims of the world's religions, which he means to deprecate. For he asserts a truth, or in this case a falsehood, about the way things ultimately are. And he does so in a way presupposing some non-empirical or supersensible intuition or insight. Finally, no, atheism is not the more intelligent position. On the contrary, atheism is self-contradictory. Think about it. The atheist says there is no God. Now, anyone who says there is no blank is giving voice to what a logician would call a universal negative proposition, whatever you place in the blank. It's negative because it says no and denies something, and it's universal because the field it encompasses is unlimited. If I said, "There is no platypus in this chapel," I would also be uttering a negative statement. But it wouldn't be universal because the context would be restricted to this building. And we could verify or disconfirm the truth of my statement by arming everyone in the room with a flashlight, fanning out throughout the building, and engaging in a systematic platypus hunting exercise. Notice, however, that when atheists say there is no God, they're not saying there's no God in this chapel, or there's no God in Greenville, or there's no God in our galaxy. They're saying there is no God anywhere in the entire universe, no God at all, wherever one might look throughout the full extent of reality. Their statement's universal. But in doing so, they're implying that they've done the looking. They've carefully inspected all the nooks and crannies of existence, even as we'd need to inspect all the nooks and crannies of this building to know there's no platypus in it. If, however, they've truly looked everywhere there is to look, if they can honestly say they're personally acquainted with the full extent of reality, it follows that they must be omniscient. But omniscience is an attribute of God. Therefore, in saying there is no God, atheists are implicitly claiming to be God and thus inevitably contradicting themselves. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a couple questions before moving on. Just nod or shake your head. In my lecture, I referred to a number of key authorities on what we might call the technology of the spiritual life. And I'm wondering whether you'd ever heard of them. How about Patanjali? No, I didn't think so. Nicephorus the Solitary? No again. Maybe Jalaluddin Rumi? You're cautiously nodding on this one. So I guess the name rings a bell, probably because of the popularity of his poetry. But have you actually studied his teachings? No. Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever tried to concentrate on only one thought? And have you noticed that it's almost impossible to do so for more than 3 or 4 seconds? Yes, good. So that's a familiar experience. You're familiar with the fact that your ordinary day-to-day consciousness is highly undisciplined, in fact, almost completely out of control. Here's my point. Each of the 3 sages I mentioned, the first, Patanjali, was the most renowned of all Hindu teachers of yoga. The second, Nicephorus the Solitary, was a hesychast master of the Christian East. And the third, Jalaluddin Rumi, was a great Sufi sheikh. Each of them taught his students a method for gaining control of their consciousness, for bringing it into a state of stillness or stability that could in turn serve as a portal, I'm tempted to say as a launching pad, to levels, modalities, or dimensions of consciousness ordinarily hidden or dormant, dimensions through which and in which they might come to experience directly the ultimate source of all things. You want to have evidence? You want somebody to show you God, you said? Very well. These and other great masters, both past and present, are fully prepared to assist. But they're going to require what any serious scientific person like yourself already knows is essential when testing some theory. Namely, that she enter into the laboratory, which is in this case her mind, carefully following the procedures, making use of the equipment these spiritual scientists have given her. Until you've done that, I'm sorry to say, it's just a sign of sheer ignorance to think the claims of the world's religions are not verifiable.